Lights on. This week we're going to be discussing something that started off as what was essentially shafts from golf clubs and is now masterpieces of carbon fibre. And what that is stabilisation. So, why stabilisation, Shaun?
Stabilisation is essentially an addition to the bow which, on release of the string, it holds the bow steady from any movements that you can apply to the bow. It adds weight to the bow, which allows you to aim it a little bit easier. It adds stabilisation of when the arrow is moving through the bow, it holds the bow steady. Through that, it creates downrange accuracy.
And all of this is very easy to apply to your own setup and can be easily changed by the rod you have, the weight you have on it, the length of the rod, and what damping you have. So, let's start off with what rods there are on the market, and between the mighty cheap where you can do it for 20 or 30 pounds to the very expensive where you're looking at spending over 500 pounds if you include all the weights you may need.
So at the cheap end, you're looking at a fiberglass construction that is quite flexible, or like it has a little bit of flex in it, but it's built to be cheap. It's built to take a little bit of weight, but not so much that when you shoot it, the weight's wobbling about all over the place.
And then when you go to the more expensive rods, there's other little trickery in it, but at the same time you've got what is a much stiffer rod that you can pile a lot more weight on there.
Yeah.
And when I say tricky, what sort of things are we talking about here, Shaun?
So with the high-end pieces of stabilisation, there's sometimes they've included some little features that help take out a little bit more vibration. Like my mind instantly jumps to the Doinker Avanci that has a rubber band through the centre of the stabiliser that eats up that vibration that runs through it.
So there's one other difference between certain stabiliser types, and that you can easily see in the two examples we've got down here. First of all, we have what is the multi-rod, which is essentially 4 rods that are put together to create one long rod, and with these you can create certain sections to make stiff sections, weak sections.
So these were initially designed with the mentality of if you've got thinner areas of contact, it will allow the wind to pass through it rather than hitting the side of the shaft. Now, it's one of those grey areas of does it work or doesn't it work? Because you could argue that there's more area for the wind to contact rather than less area. So this one especially, we mentioned the adjustability of where you can create those stiff sections and where you can create slightly weaker sections. That's done by moving the position of these tuners. So these can be made shorter to create stiff sections or longer to create those weaker sections. One feature of this long rod that we've got is the floating ends. This acts as another damper that is at the end of the long rod, that as vibration runs up the shaft, it gets to the heads and then moves each one independently. This can be adjusted as well, so to make it a lot more movement or a lot less with another version of this tuner. So that can be moved up and down. So Tom, do you want to talk us through the single rods?
So the single rods are, on the more expensive versions, are one shaft of carbon fibre wound together to create what is these days an extremely stiff rod in certain cases. What the example that we have here on the table shows some of the unique things that can be done with it. What we've got here are little dimples like on a golf ball. The idea is to reduce the wind effect, but at the same time, if we turn it up, it's very narrow. Again, to reduce the wind effect. It's similar stance to the multi-rod in that it tries to give you less surface area to be hit, but it's, in my opinion, it's all about that initial hit, and whether it works or not is up to you. This is a very unique rod that you don't usually find too much, and usually they're circle rods that are on the market, and each of these will provide different effects. So for example, on this one, you've got the lateral loadings are going to be different. So it's going to be very stiff that way, but weaker on the other plane. So moving on, we've got the differences between a light and a heavy setup. So Shaun, do you want to explain that a little bit?
So you'll commonly find that there's two mentalities when it comes to stabilizers. You can either have a heavy setup which allows you to kind of hunker down in the wind and not really get affected by it, or you can go to the other end of the spectrum, which is a light bow setup that allows you to get your shot off without struggling to get the shot away. It's worth bearing in mind that with the light setup, you will get affected by the wind a little bit more. Again, as Tom mentioned, it's all about that initial hit of the wind that really throws you off.
So another thing to mention is, as well, on the heavy setup, you're going to need a lot of stamina to get through a round, whereas with a light one, you won't. So maybe that initial hit of wind won't be so bad because you can come down and start again. Whereas on a heavier setup, you might be able to hold through that wind.
There's two mindsets that are the lightweight setups. You can commonly see them in the Korean archers, and then the heavy setups you can see them in the USA archers. So it's that two different mindsets about how to deal with wind it boils down to personal preference.
Is one mindset that we're going to see as a common trend throughout the video and the recurve setup stuff. But moving on to compound, so we've got two setups here, and we've got a resistive and a balanced setup. And as you know more about compound stuff, Shaun, why don't you give it the explanation?
So with a compound bow, you can set the bow up so that it's what's called a resistive setup. So if you're holding the bow up straight, so you've got that vertical riser, a resistive setup will be a side rod that tries to pull your bow off to your offside, so it pulls you away. So that's there to keep your mind and you physically engaged in the shot. So if you're constantly trying to pull that level by using your spirit level bubble, trying to keep that in the center will always keep your mind on keeping it level. With a balanced setup, you don't get that, but you get the benefit of not having to fight against your bow to keep it up at full draw.
So two very different setups that we can apply in different ways, but also we'll show you a bit later on how you can apply it to a recurve bow. But the big difference in recurve setup is whether you have an extender or not. So going back again to the Americans versus the Koreans and their trends. The Koreans typically have an extender, and whereas the Americans don't. What I've found is the difference between the two is the holding pattern without an extender is a little bit tighter, but it's more erratic within that pattern. Whereas with an extender it's a lot smoother, but it's a little bit bigger. So it's personal preference. You've got to try them both out, see what works well for you.
I personally share that opinion as well. I build a quite a heavy setup with a V-bar right next to the riser. Again, for the same reasons of the holding pattern is just a lot smoother and it just holds steadier for me.